thinking, is this the best question to ask you, or is this the worst question to ask you? But I suppose I just have to ask, what do you think infinity is?
What do I think infinity is? Well, I mean, we have lots of different kinds of infinity, and I think it's not so mysterious because we can define it mathematically and we can analyze it. And Cantor was one of his great achievements was the concept of the transfinite numbers, the well-ordered numbers, the ordinals, um, and so I think, yeah, I think infinity just isn't quite as mysterious maybe as people sometimes think, in that actually we can talk about it and we can prove things about it quite clearly. We can write down axioms that govern the different kinds of infinity. Um, I always teach my students how to count in the ordinals. Um, so we can just count up to omega squared, for example, right here. We can start counting, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and we can imagine counting through all of the finite numbers. And what's the name of the first number that comes after all those natural numbers? It's called omega. This is the first infinite ordinal. But the thing about the ordinals is that you can always add one. And so once you get to omega, then you have omega plus one, and omega plus two, omega plus three, and so on. And so you can keep counting. You know, it's like a second chapter. You counted through the finite numbers, but then you got to omega, and then you count through omega plus one, omega plus two, omega plus three, and so on. It's like counting through all the finite numbers again. And it's something fundamental about the ordinals is that if you're standing at an ordinal and you look ahead, it looks exactly the same as it did from the very beginning. You always add one and then two and three and so on. So then, of course, after the omega plus n for every finite n, the first ordinal that's beyond those is omega plus omega. And that's also known as omega times 2. And then, of course, you have omega plus 1 and omega plus 2 and so on. And eventually you get through this third chapter, this block that looks just like omega. So we have the initial finite copy of omega, and then another block and another one, omega times 3 plus n, omega times 4 plus n, and so on. And uh, uh, so we're going to count through omega many blocks of size, each of them omega. And then the first ordinal beyond all of those is called omega squared, which is omega times omega, because it's omega many copies of omega. So that's sort of counting to omega squared. And Cantor realized that actually these ordinals just keep going forever. And it was important in his analysis that he had this well-ordered sequence of numbers available for the kind of transfinite recursive processes that he was defining, such as the Cantor-Bendixson process. He needed these numbers to serve as indices for the transfinite constructions that he was undertaking in his set theoretic analysis. And they just played the role just perfectly. And then you realize it turns into this profound theory of the endless numbers falling through this sand timer forever. There's no end to them.
Yeah, because if you just explain this concept to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, what would you say? Is it that it's just infinity is this kind of like endless possibility of something to keep continuing?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, and when my kids were little, I did teach them how to count 2 omega squared. I mean, and more than that. And I think that basically anybody can learn to count into the transfinite ordinals, and you can learn about these infinite numbers in the same way that you learn about, I mean, how do kids learn about the natural numbers? Well, they learn to count to 10, and then they learn, well, it's a mistake sometimes some parents make, is that they teach their kids to count to 10 and they always stop at 10, like that's the end somehow. And I think that's the mistake that's made. And so what I recommend is that when you teach kids to count, you don't always stop at one number or other. You just sometimes go further and sometimes don't go further. And it teaches the concept that, you can keep going forever, right? And it's like the stopping decision isn't because you got to the end, right? They don't ever end. But then by the same kind of reasoning, you can you can teach that actually there's numbers after all the finite numbers, and that's how you get to omega and omega plus one and so on. And so not only do they go forever, but they keep going after that, right? And that's the interesting part of the ordinals.